What if the Queen's final act wasn't one of grace, but of vengeance? In a moment that left the entire royal circle frozen, Prince Andrew stood before stunned family members and read out Queen Elizabeth II's last will, and what followed shattered expectations. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were completely cut off. No inheritance. No titles for their children. Nothing. Why would the Queen exclude her own grandson and great-grandchildren from her legacy? What power play is at work here? And why was Andrew, of all people, chosen as the messenger? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling truth behind this royal bombshell and the silent war tearing the House of Windsor apart. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The Grand Hall of Buckingham Palace had never felt this heavy with tension. Outside, the skies were draped in a somber gray, as if nature itself sensed the storm brewing within those gilded walls. Rows of meticulously polished chairs lined the room, each filled with members of the royal family, their expressions ranging from steely determination to quiet apprehension. Whispers floated through the air like secrets long suppressed, bouncing off the towering marble pillars that had borne witness to centuries of royal legacies and scandals. Today was different. Today, the weight of history was about to collide with the present in a way that would leave irreversible cracks in the foundations of the monarchy. At the center of it all stood Prince Andrew, his posture unyielding, his gaze fixed forward. He clutched a thick, leather-bound document in his hands, the last will and testament of Queen Elizabeth II. The room fell into an almost suffocating silence as he cleared his throat, his fingers grazing the embossed royal seal on the cover. There was no mistaking the significance of this moment. This wasn't just a reading. It was an unveiling of truths long buried, of wishes cemented in ink by the late Queen herself. The whispers stopped. All eyes were now on Andrew. To his left, King Charles sat rigidly, his face betraying no emotion. Camilla's gloved hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles white against her pale skin. Across the aisle, Prince William's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on Andrew as if anticipating the strike of a blow he knew was coming. But it was Harry and Meghan who seemed to draw the most attention. Seated near the back, almost like afterthoughts in a room that once embraced them as part of its very fabric, they exchanged glances filled with tension and whispered disbelief. The Duchess's hands rested delicately on her lap, her fingers barely grazing Harry's. He, in turn, stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, his eyes shadowed with something that looked like defiance, or perhaps fear. Andrew finally spoke, his voice smooth and deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. In accordance with the late Her Majesty's wishes, I have been entrusted to read her last will and testament in full before the royal family, he announced, his gaze sweeping across the room. What is revealed today will reflect not only her final wishes but also the legacy she intended to leave behind. His voice lingered on that last word, legacy, as if it held a weight that not everyone was ready to bear. The air grew thicker, pregnant with anticipation. In a distant corner, a clock ticked with ruthless precision, each movement of its hands pulling them closer to the unknown. Reporters and royal watchers had speculated for months about what might be contained within those pages. Would the Queen reward loyalty and punish betrayal? Would she honor tradition or acknowledge change? Theories ranged from extravagant bequests to surprising exclusions. But no one could have anticipated what was about to be revealed. Andrew's fingers traced the edge of the first page, his eyes scanning the finely written script. His voice did not waver as he began to read. To my beloved son, King Charles III, I leave the estates of Sandringham and Balmoral to remain within the family as symbols of tradition and unity. There were nods of approval, murmurs of agreement. This was expected, predictable. Charles acknowledged the nods with a measured smile, his eyes flickering briefly toward Harry, as if daring him to react. Andrew continued, his tone steady. To my grandson, Prince William, I leave the Duchy of Cornwall, along with all its holdings and responsibilities, to uphold the values of the crown. William's expression remained stoic, though a flicker of relief crossed his eyes. It was his right, his destiny. Beside him, Catherine allowed herself a soft smile, her hand resting on his. But as Andrew turned the page, the atmosphere shifted. A ripple of unease skated across the room, unsettling even the most composed. His eyes lingered on the words for just a moment longer than necessary. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing off the stone walls. To my grandson, Prince Harry, he began, and the room collectively held its breath. Harry leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Andrew, the tension radiating off him palpable. Meghan's hand found his, their fingers intertwining as if bracing for impact. Andrew's gaze flicked up from the page, meeting Harry's eyes for the briefest moment before returning to the script. It is with a heavy heart that I confirm, as per the Queen's final wishes, that no financial inheritance shall be provided to Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, or to Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. His voice remained steady, unyielding, as if he were delivering a fact of nature rather than a deliberate act of exclusion. A murmur of disbelief swept through the hall, sharp and sudden. Eyes darted from face to face, searching for confirmation, for denial, anything to grasp onto. Harry's expression did not falter. His gaze remained locked on Andrew, unblinking. Meghan's hand tightened around his, her knuckles whitening, but her face remained impassive, a mask perfected over years of scrutiny. The silence stretched thin, taut like the strings of a violin waiting to snap. It was Princess and who broke the silence, her voice crisp and cutting through the disbelief. "And what of Archie and Lilibet?" she asked, her eyes never leaving Andrew. He paused, flipping to another page, his gaze steady. "The Queen has made no provisions for Archie and Lilibet in her will," he stated simply, the words falling like stones into the still waters of the room. A gasp erupted, sharp and visceral. Even Camilla's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth in what seemed like genuine shock. William's gaze flickered to his brother, and for a brief moment, the steel in his eyes softened. But it was fleeting, just a ripple before the waters settled back into stillness. Harry remained motionless, his expression unyielding, but his eyes told a different story. They shimmered with something raw and unguarded, something that even the most practiced of expressions could not mask. Beside him, Meghan's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. Silence returned, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on the room with the weight of what had just been revealed. Andrew closed the document, the echo of leather snapping shut reverberating through the hall. "Her Majesty's wishes are clear and final," he concluded, his voice carrying a note of finality that left no room for interpretation. He stepped back, his role complete, his eyes scanning the room one last time. It was done. The crowd remained seated, frozen in disbelief and speculation. Whispers began to rise, hushed and hurried, like shadows flitting through the corridors of power. What had they just witnessed? Was this the final act of retribution, or simply a consequence of choices made? Harry and Meghan sat unmoving, their expressions carved from stone, as if the weight of the world had settled squarely on their shoulders. The monarchy had spoken, and its message was deafening. The reading of the late Queen's will had sent shockwaves not only through the royal family, but across the globe. Speculation had been rampant for months leading up to that fateful day. Every tabloid, every news outlet, and even major political commentators had weighed in on what they believed would be revealed. Many were convinced that Harry and Meghan, despite their turbulent departure from royal duties, would still be woven into the fabric of royal wealth, if not for themselves, at least for their children. But as the ink dried on Andrew's somber declaration, it became clear that the monarchy was making a statement, one that echoed centuries of tradition and iron-fisted control. The will itself, bound in fine leather and stamped with the royal seal, was a testament not just to Elizabeth's wishes, but to the very essence of the monarchy's ancient customs. The royal family's relationship with wills and inheritances had always been shrouded in secrecy. Unlike ordinary citizens, whose wills were often subjected to public scrutiny, royal wills were sealed upon death and kept hidden from public view. This tradition dated back to Prince Francis of Teck in 1911, whose will was the first to be kept private after his death. Since then, the practice became standard for senior royals, ensuring that the public, and often even certain family members, remained oblivious to the dispersal of royal wealth. To understand the significance of Harry and Meghan's exclusion, one must first grasp the gravity of royal inheritance. Unlike conventional estates, the distribution of royal wealth is not simply a matter of personal preference. It is a deliberate act of safeguarding the monarchy's legacy. Properties like Sandringham House and Balmoral Castle are privately owned, passed down through generations not merely as homes but as symbols of continuity and power. It is said that the late Queen viewed these properties not just as residences, but as anchors of tradition that bind the crown to its people. By passing them to King Charles and, eventually, Prince William, the Queen ensured that the core of the monarchy remained fortified against the tides of change. For Harry, who had been raised within the walls of these estates, the decision cut deeper than mere financial loss. Sandringham had been the backdrop of countless Christmases, where he and William played in the snow-covered gardens under the watchful eyes of their grandparents. Balmoral was where the family found refuge from the scrutiny of London, where the Queen would ride horses and stroll with her dogs in the crisp Scottish air. These were not just properties, they were memories, legacies, threads of his childhood woven into the very fabric of royal life. But with Andrew's declaration, those threads unraveled, leaving Harry and his family outside the fold of royal tradition. Yet, it wasn't just the properties that signified the Queen's intent. The broader implications of financial inheritance spoke volumes about her stance on Harry's choices. Historically, royals were granted not just land but substantial financial provisions, investments, securities, and liquid assets designed to ensure their comfort and maintain the dignity of their status. The Queen herself had inherited much of her wealth from her father, King George VI, including valuable art collections, jewelry, and rare artifacts worth millions. For Harry and Meghan to be excluded from such a legacy was not merely an oversight. It was a declaration of consequence. The late Queen was known for her adherence to tradition, her unyielding belief in the sanctity of royal duty. To her, the monarchy was not a privilege but an obligation, a mantle of responsibility that required sacrifice, commitment, and above all, loyalty. Harry's departure from his royal duties, paired with Meghan's outspoken criticism of the family, had been viewed by many within the palace walls as a breach of that sacred trust. Despite public statements of support, whispers of discontent had long rippled through royal corridors. The will, it seemed, was the Queen's final word on the matter, a testament to her belief that choices come with consequences. The decision was also strategic. By consolidating wealth and property within the senior members of the family, the Queen fortified the Crown's assets, ensuring that they remained under the direct control of the monarchy. It was a move designed to protect the family from potential financial vulnerability. Had Harry and Meghan been included, there was a risk, at least from the monarchy's perspective, that royal wealth could be funneled into endeavors that conflicted with traditional values. Their Netflix deals, their public interviews, their attempts to commercialize the Sussex brand, all were seen as a divergence from the expectations of royalty. For the Queen, keeping assets within the senior line was more than just practical, it was essential. But the reading of the will also exposed deeper cracks within the family structure. Prince William, stoic and composed during the declaration, had been seen exchanging brief glances with his father. Insiders would later whisper that this was a sign of agreement, a silent nod of approval that the monarchy had taken the right course of action. Others, however, viewed it as cold and calculated, a betrayal of brotherhood masked beneath the veneer of duty. How could William, once so close to Harry, sit idly by while his brother was effectively disinherited from the very legacy they were both born into? The answer, it seemed, lay in loyalty, not to Harry, but to the Crown. The royal tradition of secrecy also played a role in how the will was revealed. Unlike common families where probate courts require transparency, royal wills are kept sealed, often for decades. The will of the Queen Mother was kept under wraps for nearly 50 years, with its contents never fully disclosed to the public. The same applied to Princess Margaret, whose estate remains largely a mystery even today. This veil of secrecy is maintained to protect the dignity and privacy of the monarchy, shielding it from public scrutiny and potential backlash. For Harry and Meghan, it meant that the decision was final, with no room for dispute or public inquiry. The late Queen's decision was not just a financial matter. It was a statement about legacy, duty, and allegiance. By withholding financial inheritance, she had drawn a line in the sand, one that separated those who embraced the institution of the monarchy from those who sought to redefine it. It was not simply a matter of money, but a declaration of loyalty, an expectation that those who represented the Crown must also protect its sanctity. Harry and Meghan's absence from the will was a clear message. Their path, divergent as it was, came with a cost. Yet, the question lingered, what would this mean for the Sussex children? Archie and Lilibet, who had been born into royalty yet stripped of titles and now financial inheritance, stood at the edge of a legacy that would never be theirs. The Queen's silence on their future spoke volumes. For a woman known for her precision and forethought, this was no oversight. It was a choice, one that would ripple across the monarchy for years to come. As Andrew's voice faded from the hall, the echoes of the Queen's wishes settled like dust upon the room. Outside, the sky remained heavy, its gray hues mirroring the tension that had yet to dissipate. For Harry and Meghan, the legacy of the Crown had spoken, and its message was resounding. The choice of Prince Andrew as the executor and reader of Queen Elizabeth II's will was, without question, a move that stunned many and raised countless eyebrows both within the royal family and across the world. Traditionally, the role of executor is reserved for those with unimpeachable reputations, a sense of gravitas, and the unwavering respect of both the public and the monarchy. But Andrew's reputation had been battered, his name dragged through scandal after scandal, leaving many to question why the late Queen would entrust him with such a critical role at such a pivotal moment. To understand the gravity of this decision, it's important to look back at the life and legacy of Prince Andrew. Once regarded as the spare to Charles's heir, Andrew had spent much of his early life in the limelight, enjoying the luxuries and privileges that came with royal status. He served with distinction in the Royal Navy as a helicopter pilot during the Falklands War and was often seen as the more adventurous and daring of the Queen's children. His charm and bravery earned him the nickname Randy Andy, celebrated in British tabloids as the Playboy Prince. But the tides of favor shifted dramatically over the years. The scandal that would come to define Andrew's later years began quietly, but grew into a firestorm of controversy that threatened the very integrity of the royal family. His close associations with Jeffrey Epstein, the disgraced financier and convicted sex offender, left an indelible stain on his public image. The infamous photograph of Andrew with Virginia Giuffre, who accused him of sexual misconduct when she was underage, sparked outrage and disbelief. Andrew denied the allegations vehemently, but the damage had been done. His BBC interview in 2019, intended to clear his name, only fanned the flames. His apparent lack of empathy, combined with confusing and contradictory statements, led to widespread public backlash. The Queen, in response to growing pressure, stripped Andrew of his royal duties, effectively exiling him from public engagements. Yet, here he was, front and center, the voice of the Queen's final testament. The decision to appoint Andrew as the reader of her will was seen by many as a deliberate message. Was it an act of redemption, a mother's final act of faith in her son? Or was it a calculated move to shield others from the inevitable backlash of what would be revealed? Whatever the motivation, Andrew's presence at the helm of such a monumental event was a clear signal that the Queen's loyalty to her children, scandals notwithstanding, remained unyielding. Inside Buckingham Palace, the tension was palpable. Andrew's hands were steady as he read from the meticulously prepared document, his voice smooth, betraying none of the strain that must have surely simmered beneath his composed exterior. His gaze moved carefully across the room as he spoke, pausing for breath at strategic moments, as though allowing each revelation to settle like dust on polished marble floors. Observers noted the flickers of discomfort on the faces of certain royals as Andrew read on, particularly when he addressed Harry and Meghan's exclusion. William's eyes had darkened, his jaw set firmly as though bracing for the blow. Charles, ever the stoic, had merely tightened his grip on the arms of his chair, fingers blanching under the strain. It was Harry, however, who seemed to watch Andrew with a gaze that simmered with something far deeper than disbelief. It was betrayal, raw and unvarnished. But Andrew did not flinch. He continued reading, his voice steady, his eyes unyielding. For many, it was a surreal moment. How could a man so steeped in controversy and scandal stand as the executor of the late Queen's final wishes? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered but ever present. Some speculated that Andrew's selection was symbolic, a gesture of solidarity by the Queen, signaling that family loyalty trumped public perception. Others believed it was strategic, a method of placing the most controversial figure in the monarchy in the crosshairs of public outrage, thereby sparing the others. If there were to be outrage over the will's contents, and clearly there was, Andrew would be the lightning rod. He would absorb the shock, allowing Charles and William to maintain their stoic reserve, shielded from direct backlash. To some within the royal circle, Andrew's role was a form of redemption, a last opportunity to prove his loyalty and dedication to the crown. Stripped of titles and banished from public duties, this moment was his chance to demonstrate that he could still serve the monarchy with honor, despite his tarnished reputation. He was the Queen's second son, and for all his faults, she had chosen him to carry out her final wishes. That was not a decision made lightly. For Harry and Meghan, Andrew's presence was an insult layered upon injury. His scandal had brought shame to the family, yet here he was, reading their exclusion with the same practiced detachment as one might recite the weather. Meghan, seated beside Harry, kept her expression frozen in place, lips pursed and eyes fixed on Andrew with an intensity that could have shattered glass. Harry's hands were clenched tightly in his lap, the muscles in his forearms taut with restraint. It was as if every syllable that left Andrew's mouth was a stone hurled directly at them, deliberate and unrelenting. For the spectators in the room, the dynamic was impossible to ignore. Here was Andrew, the scandal-ridden prince, executing the will of the most powerful monarch in the world, while Harry, the once beloved prince now turned royal exile, sat powerless to change his fate. There were whispers among courtiers and distant relatives that the Queen's decision to exclude Harry and Meghan while allowing Andrew such prominence was a statement of loyalty, a line drawn in the sand. Harry had walked away. Andrew, for all his flaws, had remained. As the reading continued, the gravity of Andrew's role became clearer. He wasn't just reading the Queen's wishes. He was embodying them, executing her will not just in word but in spirit. His posture was rigid, his tone exacting, leaving no room for interpretation or rebuttal. It was the final act of a monarch who had spent her life safeguarding the institution of the crown, and Andrew was her chosen vessel. When Andrew closed the leather-bound will, the room remained in silence, the air thick with unspoken words and barely contained emotions. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room, lingering briefly on Harry and Meghan before settling back on his brother, King Charles. A nod was exchanged, brief, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. It was a gesture of solidarity, of unity, and perhaps of triumph. For the outside world, the image of Andrew standing before the gathered royals, declaring the final wishes of Queen Elizabeth II, would be seared into memory. Headlines would capture his face, the polished leather of the will in his hands, the unyielding posture of a man who had been given one final chance to serve his family, however tainted his reputation might have been. And for Harry and Meghan, it was a blow that cut deeper than any public criticism or media speculation. This was family, their own blood, standing before them and declaring their exclusion without hesitation or remorse. It was a fracture in the House of Windsor that would not easily heal, a scar that would mark their departure not just from the family, but from the legacy that had once been their birthright. The room in Buckingham Palace was not large by royal standards, but on that day, it felt cavernous. The vaulted ceiling seemed to loom higher than usual, as if pulled upward by the tension rising in the air. The walls, adorned with regal portraits and age-worn tapestries, bore silent witness to a moment that would echo through the centuries. What had begun as a ceremonial occasion, the reading of a sovereign's final wishes, was unraveling into a deeply personal reckoning. As Prince Andrew prepared to read the Queen's will, silence settled like fog over the room. No one dared speak. A few glances were exchanged, some cold, others merely curious, but most eyes were glued to Andrew. For all his controversy, his presence commanded attention. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man stripped of royal duties was now the voice of the Queen herself. The Queen's will had never been a matter of indifference. The late monarch had ruled for 70 years, longer than most of the world's population had been alive. She had been the bedrock of British identity, the unwavering presence through wars, divorces, scandals, and shifting social tides. Her will, rumored, speculated, and feverishly debated in the press, was viewed as a final message, a judgment call from a woman who had always kept her cards close. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Court officials stood at the sides like sentinels, their expressions unreadable. Close relatives filled the front rows. King Charles with Camilla beside him, Prince William and Catherine a few chairs away, their postures composed but tense. Further back, Prince Edward and his wife Sophie, princess, and with her signature no-nonsense demeanor, and a cluster of lesser royals formed a semi-circle around the center of the room. It was at the rear, noticeably distant from the inner circle, where Harry and Meghan sat. Their position in the room spoke volumes. Not exiled, perhaps, but certainly sidelined. The seating chart had not been a mistake, it was a message. Meghan, dressed in a subdued beige coat dress, held herself with poised restraint, but her eyes flicked rapidly, scanning the room for any hint of warmth or support. Harry sat beside her, arms rigid, jaw clenched, his fingers twisting the edge of his cuff. He looked like a soldier waiting for the shot that would end the stalemate. The moment Andrew opened the will, the rustle of parchment against leather was louder than expected, like the drawing of a blade from its sheath. Every eye followed his movements. He began reading with solemn clarity, and at first, The content followed expected formality. To His Majesty, King Charles III, I bequeath the estates of Balmoral and Sandringham to be held in stewardship for the continuation of the monarchy's traditional obligations. There was no surprise there. The Queen's favorite country retreats were expected to go to Charles. Camilla offered a subtle, approving nod. Charles remained impassive, though the tightness around his eyes suggested relief that this formality was behind him. To my grandson, Prince William, I leave the remainder of the Crown's private art collection housed at Windsor Castle, including all accompanying deeds and intellectual rights. May these serve as symbols of the future and of the enduring legacy of our shared history. Again, no shock. William's star had been rising steadily since Harry's exit. He had become the face of a modern monarchy, towing the line between tradition and transformation. Kate's expression was one of quiet affirmation, no gloating, just acceptance of what had long been set in motion. But it was what came next that held the room hostage. Andrew paused. He stared at the page as though weighing how to read it, not whether to say it, but how. The room leaned forward collectively. Even the guards stiffened. To my grandson, Prince Harry, and to his wife, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. A heartbeat passed. I make no financial provision. It is my wish that all inheritances, assets, holdings, and estate-related entitlements bypass the Sussex line. This decision is final. The words landed like bricks. Audible gasps rippled through the room. A few sharp exhales, a stifled sob perhaps from one of the younger royals or staff. Meghan's eyes closed slowly. When she opened them, they glistened. Harry didn't move. Not a blink. His face, though pale, remained composed. The weight of what had just been said hit harder than any tabloid headline. It was not merely a matter of money, it was a matter of identity. Legacy. Family. Acceptance. To be excluded was one thing. To be named and excluded publicly was another. This was not oversight. This was intention. Andrew, to his credit, did not look smug or defiant. He read with precision, like a man executing orders he didn't necessarily endorse, but didn't question either. He turned the page. The document rustled again. The sound now felt cruel. To Archie and Lilibet Mountbatten Windsor. The children, even they weren't spared. I leave no holdings, titles, or entitlements in this will. My wishes are for the continued preservation of the monarchy through those who have demonstrated commitment to its principles and responsibilities. There it was. A royal decree disguised as a personal decision. Harry's jaw twitched. Meghan placed a hand on his knee, but even she seemed unsure whether it was meant to comfort him or herself. The room remained frozen. No one dared move. For a moment, not even the air seemed to circulate. Andrew continued, moving on to bequests for Princess and Prince Edward and minor relatives. Jewelry, estates, minor properties, heirlooms, dispersed like chapters in a family history now closed. But no one in the room heard any of it. Not truly. The shadow of Harry and Meghan's exclusion hung like a fog over everything else. It was not just shocking. It was seismic. Outside the palace, the press waited. They didn't yet know the contents of the will, but cameras flashed wildly as aides began to trickle out, their faces tight, their phones already buzzing. Within minutes, the news would spread. Networks would scramble. Commentators would erupt. Hashtags would explode. Royal historians would be summoned to studios. Analysts would dissect every sentence. But inside that room, the silence continued to fester. Eventually, Andrew closed the will. The leather cover slapped shut with finality. He did not speak again. There was nothing left to say. It was King Charles who stood first. Whether out of habit, duty, or to break the unbearable tension, no one knew. He nodded once, an acknowledgement to Andrew, not approval. William followed. Kate rose, her eyes briefly meeting Meghan's before turning away. And Edward, Sophie, one by one, they filed out, some with glances of sympathy, others with none at all. Harry and Meghan remained seated. They were the last to rise. Harry's shoulders were hunched, not in defeat but in reflection. He had come not expecting grace, but perhaps a gesture, a whisper of warmth, a silent acknowledgement of blood and bond. What he received was a door slammed shut. Meghan reached for his hand again, and this time, he held it tightly. As they exited the room, palace staff stood by the door. Not one bowed. No words were exchanged. None needed to be. In that moment, a message had been sent, not just to the Sussexes, but to the world. The monarchy would endure. But it would do so without them. The decision to leave Prince Harry and Meghan Markle entirely out of Queen Elizabeth II's final will was not a clerical oversight. It was not a miscommunication. It was, by every available indication, a deliberate, pointed, and deeply symbolic move. The moment Andrew read aloud that no financial inheritance would be granted to the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, or even to their children, it ceased to be merely a matter of royal wealth. It became a seismic message, calculated and cold, delivered from beyond the grave by the monarch who once famously said, "Recollections may vary. It is difficult to overstate the significance of being written out of a royal will." In the British monarchy, inheritance is not merely a distribution of assets, it is a reinforcement of lineage, loyalty, and legacy. Throughout history, monarchs have used their wills as a means to solidify their vision for the future of the crown, ensuring that wealth, influence, and symbolic possessions pass to those they consider both worthy and faithful. For Queen Elizabeth II to exclude Harry, a grandson born into privilege and raised within the bosom of royal tradition, and Meghan, his wife and mother of two of her great-grandchildren, it was an unmistakable declaration. They were no longer part of the royal future. This was not about money. The Queen's personal fortune, estimated to exceed £400 million, included priceless art, rare jewels, private estates, and extensive investments, resources capable of sustaining generations. A small trust, a minor bequest, a piece of land, any of these would have sufficed to signal inclusion, however subtle. Instead, the Queen opted for exclusion so absolute that even a symbolic gesture was withheld. Not a brooch, not a painting, not a written message to be opened in private. Nothing. To understand the calculated nature of this decision, one must revisit the unraveling of the Sussexes' relationship with the royal family. It wasn't a single act that triggered the rupture, but a gradual, escalating divergence of values and behavior. When Harry and Meghan announced in January 2020 that they would be stepping back from their roles as senior royals, the palace was caught off guard. The Queen, known for her commitment to duty, was reportedly blindsided by their declaration and disappointed by the way it was communicated, publicly and without proper protocol. Even after their departure, there were opportunities for reconciliation. The Queen hosted the so-called Sandringham Summit to address their transition, offering the couple a pathway to a more flexible form of royal service. But their decision to pursue commercial deals, particularly the multi-million-dollar partnerships with Netflix and Spotify, was seen as a commodification of royal status, a violation of the unspoken code that royals serve, not sell. Then came the Oprah interview. When Harry and Meghan sat across from Oprah Winfrey in March 2021 and laid bare their grievances with the institution, from accusations of racism to claims of abandonment, the Queen's carefully cultivated image of quiet dignity was fractured. Though her official response was measured, it contained one of the most memorable lines of her reign. Some recollections may vary. That line became a shield for the monarchy and a subtle slap to the Sussexes. It was also, in hindsight, a prelude to what was revealed in her will. So was this Queen Elizabeth's way of exacting a final reckoning? Was this exclusion punishment? Many royal observers believe so, though they are careful with their words. The Queen was not a woman known for emotional retribution. She did not speak in anger or act on impulse. But she did believe in consequence. She believed that actions have weight. She had seen what happened when the crown was diluted by scandal and self-interest. Her uncle, Edward VIII, had abdicated for love and left the monarchy in crisis. She, more than anyone, knew the dangers of personal desires superseding public responsibility. In many ways, Harry's trajectory mirrored that of his great-uncle, a beloved royal who fell in love with an outsider, a couple who sought to redefine their role, a public split with the institution. But where the Queen's father had to rebuild the monarchy from the ashes of Edward's abdication, Elizabeth was determined not to let history repeat itself. Excluding Harry and Meghan from her was a firm wall, unclimbable, unbreakable. It was the Queen's line in the sand. Still, to exclude the children, Archie and Lilibet, seemed particularly harsh. While Meghan and Harry had made their choices, the children were blameless. Yet, even they were shut out. No trust funds. No land. Not even heirlooms. Some experts speculate this was because of the uncertainty around their status. Born in the United States, outside of the realm, and growing up apart from the institution that might have shaped their royal identity. Others say it was a sign that the Queen had lost confidence in the Sussexes entirely and, by extension, their offspring. From a practical standpoint, the decision to exclude Harry and Meghan was likely also influenced by concerns over public perception. The royal family has endured scandal after scandal, from Diana's death to Prince Andrew's legal controversies, including Harry and Meghan and the Queen's will, even modestly, might have risked sending a mixed message. Could the monarchy endorse their behavior while simultaneously distancing itself from their decisions? Could it publicly rebuke their criticisms while privately rewarding them? The Queen, known for her consistency, chose clarity. Her will was an unambiguous declaration of where she stood. But there was another layer, more strategic and institutional. The monarchy is not just a family, it is a machine, a constitutional entity. It must project strength, unity, and control. In this light, Queen Elizabeth's decision was not only personal but political. She was reinforcing the institution's hierarchy. In her eyes, Harry had stepped outside the line of succession, not legally, but spiritually. William, the heir, had doubled down on duty. Harry had walked away. And the Queen, a custodian of centuries of royal precedent, made her judgment final. And yet, despite the logic, the decision was not without human cost. Harry's silence in the moments following the reading was deafening. Here was a man who had walked behind his mother's coffin, who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, who had carried out royal duties with charm and grace for years. His fall from grace had not been total. His popularity in some circles remained strong. But in the eyes of the monarchy, the only court that mattered that day, he was out. Meghan, too, had been punished. Her treatment by the British press had been brutal and at times racist. She had sought escape, but her inclusion in the Queen's will could have signaled forgiveness, a chance to move forward. That window, too, was now closed. What happens next remains uncertain. Legal experts agree that contesting a royal will is virtually impossible. They are sealed and protected by layers of privacy and custom. There will be no courtroom battle, no appeals, no second chances. What was read aloud in that gilded room is final. The ink is dry. The verdict delivered. For some, the Queen's decision was justified, a monarch preserving her legacy, rewarding duty and loyalty, and punishing perceived betrayal. For others, it was unnecessarily cruel, a final twist of the knife in a family saga already drenched in pain and public scrutiny. What is clear is this: the Queen's final will was more than a legal document. It was a symbol, a declaration, a closing chapter in a story that continues to haunt the House of Windsor. In the hours following the public reading of Queen Elizabeth II's final will, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace remained eerily subdued. Outside the gates, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, questions shouted into the wind, their voices drowned out by the sound of silence emanating from within. The royal motorcade had long departed, and inside the palace walls, a different storm brewed, one that was quieter, more personal, but just as devastating. Harry and Meghan had not expected warmth. They had not anticipated embraces or applause. But the complete exclusion, the surgical precision with which their names and those of their children had been removed from royal legacy, struck with a brutality neither of them could have prepared for. For Harry, the blow was not just financial, not even primarily so. It was existential, a confirmation that he had become a stranger in the very institution he was born to inherit. Back at their residence, far removed from the palace's grandeur and symbolism, Harry was uncharacteristically silent. His eyes, often animated even in frustration, had taken on a distant, hollow quality. He sat on the edge of a chair, still in his formal suit, tie slightly loosened, staring through the window as if trying to process the implications of what had just happened. Meghan, having removed her coat but still dressed formally, hovered nearby. Her own reaction had been quieter than many would have expected. There were no tears, no dramatic outbursts, just a long silence, broken only by a whispered, "I'm so sorry," repeated more than once. The whether to Harry or to herself was unclear. When the door finally closed behind them after they left the will reading, the weight of isolation became suffocating. Not a single member of the royal family had approached them. Not one word of consolation or private explanation had been offered. No eye contact, no nod of acknowledgement. It was as though they no longer existed within the royal bloodstream. For Meghan, the moment was surreal. She had known her marriage into the monarchy would be controversial, had expected challenges, but nothing prepared her for this quiet erasure. The palace had not issued any official statement, and that was by design. The Queen's will had spoken, and in the royal family's code, there was nothing more to be said. The act of removing them was final. But the world outside had questions, and Harry knew it. Journalists from London to Los Angeles were already drafting headlines. Within minutes of the will being read, word had leaked. Anonymous sources inside the palace fed the press with carefully crafted language. Her Majesty valued duty over defiance. The Queen prioritized the stability of the monarchy. But behind the platitudes, the truth was sharper. Harry had been disinherited, not as punishment, the palace would imply, but as precedent. And now, he had to live with it. In private, Harry's reaction evolved slowly. He did not explode. He did not cry. He didn't even speak for nearly 2 hours after returning from the palace. Instead, he paced. Meghan followed him silently, watching. When he finally spoke, it was not in anger, but in deep, weary reflection. "She wrote me out of her will," he said, the words low, almost inaudible. "She wrote all of us out," Meghan replied. Harry turned, eyes dark with disbelief. Archie and Lilibet. She didn't leave them a thing. Not even a token. Not even a letter. Meghan hesitated. "I think that's what hurts most. That it wasn't just about us. That she didn't want them connected to any of it either." For Harry, the realization was suffocating. This wasn't just about being left out of an inheritance. It was a formal acknowledgement from the head of the family and the crown that he no longer belonged. His wife wasn't accepted. His children weren't welcomed. His blood meant nothing. The monarchy had drawn its line, and he was on the wrong side of it. He wandered into a private room and closed the door behind him. There, surrounded by photos of his mother, of moments from his military service, of happier times with his brother, he finally allowed himself a moment of truth. The Queen's decision wasn't sudden. It had been building for years, perhaps even before the Oprah interview, maybe even before the wedding. He thought back to those early meetings, the long dinners, the subtle remarks, the way Meghan had been spoken about, never directly, but always hinted. The cold smiles, the quiet exclusions from inner circle briefings. He had ignored it then, convinced that time and consistency would thaw hearts. He had been wrong. Meghan's own internal storm was no less tumultuous. She had always prided herself on self-sufficiency. But the rejection of her children wounded her in a place she hadn't expected. This wasn't a tabloid headline or an internet smear campaign. This was family. And the matriarch of that family had, in the most official way possible, made it clear that their branch was no longer considered part of the tree. Not even a financial safety net was extended to the children. No trust funds. No heirlooms. No honorary mentions. The message was brutal. You are not part of us. There were whispers of what the couple would do next. Some speculated that Harry would launch a scathing attack in a second memoir. Others predicted a return to television interviews or a legal challenge, though even Harry knew the latter was futile. The will was sealed. There would be no appeals. In the private royal universe, there were rules, and this rule was final. What Harry did next, however, was unexpected. Instead of retreating further, he reached out to his inner circle. Former aides, old friends. Not to plot revenge, but to understand what came next. How do you exist when your heritage has been stripped from you? How do you raise children who have royal blood but no royal acknowledgement? In the days that followed, Harry became more resolute. The Queen's decision, while devastating, had crystallized his purpose. He no longer had to question where he stood. He no longer had to hope for inclusion. That chapter was closed. Now, he would write his own. Meghan, too, began to refocus. The pain was there, but so was clarity. The royal system had rejected them, but they still had power, and voice, and presence, and their ability to influence a world beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. They had been disinherited, yes, but they were not powerless. Behind the scenes, sources close to the Sussexes suggested that Meghan had begun speaking with media strategists, preparing for a measured public statement, not to retaliate, but to control the narrative. She wanted to express disappointment, perhaps even sorrow, but without malice. She knew the world would be watching. Her children would one day read whatever came next. It had to be done right. As for Harry, his reaction remained quiet. But those close to him reported long walks, quiet talks with close friends, and a deep reflection on his mother, Diana, who had herself been cast aside by the monarchy. He often visited the bench in his California garden dedicated to her. And in those moments, he felt a strange connection to her pain. He wasn't alone in being excluded. She had lived it too. And yet, for all their pain, neither Harry nor Meghan would beg for inclusion again. The Queen had spoken. Her final will had cut them off. But it had also freed them. In the aftermath of their disinheritance, as the headlines spread like wildfire and analysts dissected every word of the Queen's final will, Meghan Markle found herself at a crossroads. For years, she had been a lightning rod for controversy, cast in the British press as everything from a social climber to a manipulator, a disruptor to royal tradition. But now, the narrative had taken a new turn. The monarchy itself had publicly confirmed what the world had only speculated. She, and by extension her children, were no longer considered part of the royal fold. The public exclusion, especially of Archie and Lilibet, did something else entirely. It triggered a wave of sympathy that Meghan hadn't seen in years. People who had once criticized her now found themselves questioning the harshness of the Queen's decision. The children didn't deserve this, read one editorial in a major American publication. Whatever the politics, this was a family decision made with ice in its veins, wrote another. Meghan saw something in that shift. Not just a change in tone, but an opportunity. The sympathy wave was real, and in a media landscape that thrives on redemption arcs, she knew the moment to move was now. The world had long framed her as the outsider who broke the palace's composure. But what if she could reshape that narrative? What if she could show the world that she wasn't the villain, but the survivor? Behind the scenes in Montecito, her home in California became a war room. Meghan reached out to trusted advisors, media strategists, brand consultants, crisis communications experts. Her goal was not revenge. It was something far more calculated: reclamation. She wanted to take back control of the story, to turn exclusion into empowerment, silence into purpose. In confidential meetings, a plan began to form. A documentary series had already been discussed long before the will was read, one focused on motherhood, legacy, and identity. Now, Meghan saw how her current circumstances could frame that story in an entirely different light. Not just as a personal exploration of her life outside the crown, but as a statement about resilience in the face of institutional rejection. One strategist, a former network executive, reportedly told her, "You don't need the monarchy to be royal. Your story is more powerful than their silence." Meghan took the idea seriously. She began journaling again, a habit she had shelved after the fallout from their Oprah interview. In the quiet of night, after the children were asleep and Harry had gone for a walk, she would sit at her desk, candlelit, and write pages of reflections. Not rage, not sadness, but clarity. She wrote about what it felt like to be silenced in rooms full of tradition. She wrote about watching her children play, knowing they would never step foot in Windsor Castle as welcomed heirs. She wrote about dignity, how it is taken, how it is reclaimed. These writings were deeply personal, but some insiders believe they could form the basis of her next book. A memoir not just of escape from the institution, but of rising after the final blow had been dealt. But Meghan also understood the value of timing. A media offensive launched too early would look opportunistic. Too late, and the momentum would die. So she waited. She met privately with production teams, looking over documentary outlines and promotional ideas. She declined interviews. When asked by journalists for comment, her team offered only a short statement. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex are focused on their family at this time and have no further comment. It was a move that played well with public sentiment, dignified, restrained, and quietly defiant. At the same time, Meghan began laying the groundwork for broader advocacy efforts. While her Archewell Foundation had continued its charitable work, Meghan now envisioned a new initiative, one focused on legacy and equity for children from marginalized families. "If our kids won't inherit land or titles, let them inherit purpose," she reportedly told one associate. This new direction, insiders suggest, could become Meghan's defining platform, a way to channel her frustration into meaningful change and to distinguish herself from the monarchy's model of inherited privilege. In Montecito, the energy shifted. Staff noted Meghan was working longer hours, more focused, more involved in every detail. Meetings ran late into the night. Conversations were strategic, layered, future-focused. She wasn't just planning a response, she was building an empire. Some media outlets speculated that Meghan might consider returning to acting. After all, she had left Suits as a rising star, and Hollywood remained curious about her next move. But those close to her dismissed the idea. Meghan was no longer interested in scripts written by others. She wanted to shape her own narrative, not perform someone else's. She also sought to mend bridges, but not with the palace. Instead, she reached out to thought leaders, women in politics, social justice advocates. Private calls with Michelle Obama's team were rumored. Discussions with global education nonprofits intensified. Meghan wanted to use her platform not just for her story, but for those who didn't have one. And then there were the children. The exclusion of Archie and Lilibet from the Queen's will had wounded her deeply. Meghan began planning a children's book, a story about a boy and girl who were told they don't belong in the castle, but who discover that their strength comes from within, not from a crown. Publishers showed immediate interest. The symbolism was obvious, but the message, hopeful, gentle, empowering, was pure. Through it all, she kept a line of communication open with Harry's inner circle, but her focus was not on royal reconciliation. She had accepted that part of her life was over. Instead, she was focused on building something new, something she could own, something no monarchy could revoke. She and Harry agreed early on they would not appear weak or bitter. There would be no public tears, no accusations. They would be dignified, focused, and intentional. But that didn't mean they would stay silent forever. As public interest swelled, media outlets began to position Meghan as a woman scorned but unbroken. Stories shifted. From royal outcast to global advocate, one headline read. Meghan Markle's second act, read another. The timing of it all worked in her favor. Public empathy rose, especially in the United States, where anti-monarchist sentiment and social justice movements created fertile ground for her next moves. Meghan understood the media better than most. She knew she had one chance to get this right. The exclusion had hurt, but it had also handed her a new kind of freedom. She would no longer be expected to smile silently next to people who didn't accept her. She would no longer have to follow centuries-old traditions that placed image above humanity. The Queen's final will had released her. The shackles of royal obligation were broken. Now, Meghan was free to be exactly what the institution had feared, herself. And perhaps, in the end, that was what the monarchy never anticipated. That the woman they pushed out would not disappear. She would rise. The palace had spoken. The Queen's will had confirmed it. And now, for the first time in his life, Prince Harry was entirely without a royal safety net. No inheritance. No property. No assets handed down from the monarch who had guided the family for over 7 decades. He had not just been excluded, he had been disowned, symbolically and financially. And as the enormity of that reality settled in, Harry found himself confronting the terrifying and unfamiliar prospect of complete independence. For most of his life, Harry had operated within the gilded cage of the British monarchy. He had grown up with the comfort of knowing that no matter what happened, scandals, slip-ups, or tabloid fiascos, there was always the institution to fall back on. Royal privilege came with its own set of protections, private security, access to exclusive networks, sprawling estates to retreat to in the countryside, and, above all, a deep well of generational wealth that ensured he would never need to ask how much something cost. But that was gone now. With the Queen's decision, Harry found himself standing alone in a way that few royals ever had. And despite his wealth from book deals, media partnerships, and international speaking engagements, something deeper had been stripped away. Not financial stability, he had that in the short term, but the fundamental assurance that the system he was born into would always provide for him. There is a unique kind of vulnerability that comes with being rich but no longer royal. Harry wasn't broke, but he was disconnected. In the monarchy, lineage is everything. To be financially cut off meant more than losing money. It meant losing status, trust, and validation. His titles remained in name only, their privileges largely ceremonial outside the UK. His ancestral homes were now off limits. The land he once walked freely on as a child was no longer his to enter without permission. In Montecito, California, far from the stone walls and ancestral history of Windsor, Harry began to feel the psychological weight of that disconnection. For the first time, he was truly on the outside looking in. Even as the public debated the morality of the Queen's decision, some calling it a rightful consequence, others branding it ruthless, Harry sat with the deeper realization that his royal identity was no longer enough to define him. And yet, he wasn't entirely unprepared. When he and Meghan had stepped down as senior royals, Harry had begun learning how to exist outside the monarchy's shadow. He had launched Archwell, secured content deals with major streaming platforms, and gone on a speaking circuit that positioned him as a voice for mental health, veterans affairs, and social progress. But those efforts, while commendable, were always seen through the lens of his royalty. The brand was still Harry of Windsor. Now, he would have to find a way to exist without that frame. Financially, the situation was complicated. He and Meghan had purchased their Montecito home for over $14 million, funded in part by Harry's inheritance from Princess Diana, estimated at around £10 million, and bolstered by their Netflix deal, reportedly worth $100 million. But money earned is money spent. Security for their family alone cost several $1 million annually. Legal fees, staff salaries, private travel, and charitable commitments burned through wealth quickly. And now, without any future royal trust funds or inheritances to rely on, Harry had to think long-term for his children, for his legacy, and for his identity. Those close to him say Harry began to reassess everything in the days following the will reading. He reviewed Archwell's financial model. He revisited ongoing contracts and renegotiated key clauses with his legal team. He even quietly met with advisors outside the family circle to explore independent investment strategies. There was no panic, but there was urgency. The Queen's final decision had stripped away the illusion that he could always return if things fell apart. One of the more painful aspects of his new reality was the recognition that even his children would not receive the symbolic safety net of royal privilege. For years, he had fought to protect them from the toxicity of royal life, but he had always assumed they would be given the opportunity to choose for themselves. The Queen's will made it clear. Archie and Lilibet were not just outsiders in practice, but officially removed from the inner sanctum of Windsor legacy. They would grow up with royal blood, but without royal connection. Their identity would always be caught between two worlds, royal by birth, yet orphaned by decree. This created a new urgency in Harry's mind. He wanted to give his children something to hold on to, not castles or titles, but values, identity, and purpose. For that, he began to reconsider his public image. While his memoir, Spare, had pulled back the curtain on the inner dysfunction of the royal family, its candid tone had also drawn criticism. He had painted his father and brother in unflattering terms, and now, with the Queen's will as the final chapter of that family fracture, Harry felt he needed to evolve his messaging. He began speaking with new advisors, people who weren't part of the royal machinery or the Hollywood PR machine. He wanted honesty, strategy, and grounding. He asked hard questions. What would his brand be in 5 years? How could he protect his family without appearing bitter? How could he remain authentic without sounding vengeful? And perhaps most importantly, what did it mean to be a royal who no longer belonged to the royal family? The answer didn't come immediately, but he began to define it. He was still a veteran, still a father, still a public figure with global influence. He was still the son of Princess Diana, whose own exile from the crown had become an icon of defiance and grace. He could rebuild, not in the palace's image, but in his mother's. One of the projects he began developing was a new Veterans Initiative, a global platform to support mental health, reintegration, and employment for former military personnel. It would be built outside the royal apparatus, fully independent, with funding from private sources and sponsors rather than legacy trusts. He wanted it to be sustainable, untouchable by the institution that had disowned him. He also revisited Invictus. The Games remained one of his proudest achievements, a program he had nurtured and expanded into a global force. But now, he wanted to amplify its impact. More than a competition, he envisioned a network of veteran-focused content, mentorship programs, and outreach initiatives that could reach beyond sporting events. He believed that his credibility as a soldier could be reasserted, even as his credibility as a royal was eroded. But beyond the strategy, there were moments of doubt. Friends said that Harry often sat in silence for long stretches, processing not just the pain of rejection but the fear of irrelevance. Without the Queen's protection, without the institutional seal of approval, who was he? Could he hold public attention without being a figure of scandal or nostalgia? Could he lead without a crown? In private, he spoke often of his mother. He kept a framed photo of her on his desk, one from the early 1990s, when she had begun reshaping her public role after divorce. He saw in her the roadmap he now needed to follow. She had used her platform to humanize herself, to connect with causes that mattered, to show the world that a royal could still be meaningful even without a title. Harry wanted to do the same. But this time, the stakes were higher. The world wasn't watching with sympathy alone. It was watching with scrutiny. And yet, the Queen's will had done something unexpected. It had hardened him, focused him, freed him. For the first time, he had nothing to lose. And that, in its own strange way, became his greatest asset. No statements, no clarifications, not even the faintest whisper of regret or reconsideration. Buckingham Palace remained a fortress of unreadable stoicism. The Queen's death had left a vacuum, but the institution she left behind had closed ranks with such precision that even veteran royal watchers were stunned. The decision to say nothing, to release no further explanation, wasn't simply a public relations strategy. It was a maneuver deeply rooted in the monarchy's centuries-old method of self-preservation, silence as survival. But was it strategic? Or was it tactical? To the outside world, the royal family's refusal to comment on the Queen's final decision appeared both cold and calculated. Yet within the palace walls, the choice to maintain silence was layered, deliberate, and, in the eyes of senior courtiers, necessary. They understood the risk of fanning the flames. Anything said would only give oxygen to speculation, emotion, and, worst of all, debate. The monarchy does not debate. It does not explain. It acts, and the world adjusts. Internally, however, the silence was anything but passive. Senior aides to King Charles, including those tasked with navigating the first years of his reign, had anticipated a media storm the moment the will was read. It was, in fact, one of the final operations quietly planned by Queen Elizabeth herself. Sources close to the palace confirmed that the Queen had discussed the implications of her will with Charles and her most trusted advisors months before her death. She understood that her decision would fracture public perception and deepen the rift with Harry. But she had made it anyway, and Charles had agreed to let her speak from beyond the grave, then say nothing after. The reasoning was simple: to speak on the matter would make it real. Royal protocol depends on projection, not confession. The moment you explain yourself, you validate the criticism. The moment you acknowledge pain, you invite further inspection. The monarchy thrives on mystique, and mystique cannot be maintained under a microscope. So, the silence held. But not all royals felt it was the right call. Behind closed doors, there were debates, sharp, uncomfortable ones, about whether the institution should have offered at least a private word to Harry. Princess and, ever the pragmatist, reportedly questioned the optics of excluding not just a son of the king but two great-grandchildren of the late Queen. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, is said to have quietly suggested that some gesture of goodwill could be made without compromising the palace's integrity. But the argument always returned to one question: what precedent would it set? If the crown responded to this controversy, would it then be expected to respond to every future criticism, every emotional fallout, every family feud made public? For King Charles, the stakes were even higher. His reign was still young, and public trust was fragile. He had begun his rule amid growing calls for a scaled-back monarchy, increased transparency, and even whispers of republicanism in Commonwealth nations. To engage emotionally on such a divisive issue could expose the monarchy to vulnerability it could not afford. By staying silent, Charles preserved the illusion of continuity, even as that illusion crumbled behind palace walls. And so, the silence became a shield. Still, the media did not relent. Reporters hounded palace press secretaries with questions. Why were Harry and Meghan excluded? Was this an act of punishment or policy? Did King Charles support this decision? The official response, always measured, never shifted: we do not comment on private family matters. It was a line that had been rehearsed, refined, and repeated like a holy incantation. Behind the scenes, however, the family was far from indifferent. The Queen's decision had reopened wounds that had only barely scabbed over. Tensions between William and Harry reignited. While William did not publicly endorse the decision, his silence was interpreted by many as quiet approval. He had always been the heir who followed the rules, while Harry had broken them. The Queen had simply codified that reality. And William, aware of the burden he carried as the future king, chose not to interfere with that judgment. Privately, however, William and Charles were said to have disagreed on how far the exclusion should go. Charles, by many accounts, wanted to offer something, if not to Harry, then to his children. He understood that future generations would look back on this moment and question it. But the Queen had made up her mind. And Charles, long in his mother's shadow, lacked the resolve to challenge her final act. Camilla remained largely detached. Her focus was on protecting Charles and ensuring the monarchy's forward momentum. She viewed the matter as settled and advised her husband to avoid further entanglement. Her position, while unsentimental, was grounded in the belief that any attempt at reconciliation would only reignite public interest and disrupt the delicate balance of Charles's new leadership. Meanwhile, the younger royals, the children of Edward and Anne, as well as Zara Tyndall and Peter Phillips, watched quietly from the sidelines. Few dared speak publicly, but in private circles, murmurs of discomfort grew. Some viewed the will's contents as harsh. Others believed it was necessary to uphold tradition. But all agreed on one thing. The royal family had entered uncharted territory, and their silence might only protect them for so long. Publicly, the silence served its purpose for a time. British media shifted their coverage gradually, returning to safer topics, royal engagements, state dinners, Commonwealth tours. But internationally, especially in the US, the firestorm persisted. Analysts questioned the monarchy's coldness, especially in a post-Diana age where emotional transparency is prized. In talk shows, news panels, and viral online commentary, the question kept echoing. How could a grandmother disinherit her grandson and great-grandchildren so publicly and with such finality? The palace ignored it all, but in their silence, they left a void. And voids get filled. Harry and Meghan, though publicly restrained, had begun controlling their own narrative. Their quiet dignity in the days after the will's reading only highlighted the palace's refusal to engage. To many, the contrast was stark. The young couple, hurt but composed, versus a rigid institution hiding behind protocol. In time, even royal insiders began to wonder if silence had been a miscalculation. Some palace officials suggested that a carefully worded tribute to family unity, even in the face of disagreement, could have softened the blow. But the moment had passed. The narrative was written. The Queen's will was sealed, and the institution had chosen stillness over softness. In the end, the royal family's silence achieved its immediate goal. It protected the crown. It avoided spectacle. It insulated Charles's early reign. But at what cost? Harry and Meghan were now permanently distanced. Their children were effectively erased from the Windsor legacy. And the world had watched it all in real time, no longer in awe, but in discomfort. Silence had once been the monarchy's strength. Now, it risked becoming its greatest weakness. The monarchy has always been a creature of tradition. Protocols, many of them